mystique about you, as you know. You're not really out in the public a lot.
We actually ended up as a touring band by accident, really. I'm talking about my partner, Walter Becker, and I. Certainly I became a frontman by accident, I know that. We just couldn't find a singer who we felt could convey the attitude we were looking for. And it became obvious that I was probably the one to do it, even though I had very little experience.
The first hit?
Well, 72 was actually Do It Again was the first hit.
Which had all the elements that we still associate with the Steely Dan mystique. The kind of a mysterious narrative line and characters involved, players, literal players in that case.
I think our model for songs was more literary or short story-like than being a model from popular music. So I guess it has something of theatrical music about it in that sense, and that it does tell a story.
The name of the group comes from a literary reference, of course.
Right. It's from William Burroughs' novel, Naked Lunch, from the 50s, or maybe even the late 40s.
That period and that style and that attitude is the mystique, I guess, that we associate the 50s, kind of this postmodernism, this romantic, almost there's a dream sense about what you're doing. What was your life like during that period, during the 50s? How did you come upon that material? Where do you fit into that material?
I grew up in Passaic, New Jersey, and then moved to the suburbs. Like a lot of families, my parents moved from the inner city out to the suburbs in the mid-50s, and this was a great shock to me, even when I was a kid. I could see that there was a lot missing about the kind of life that one leads in the suburbs, especially at that time, which was a very conservative period, and probably the most conservative in recent history in the country. I think before that, there was never the kind of conformism or very sort of repressed type of sort of life that people were living then. And that's what I grew up with. And of course, it was the beginning of television, and even as a kid, I could tell that things had changed from when I was a young child into really I could tell the world was becoming different because of technology and a lot of other factors.
The kind of lockstep conformism that we can see now in retrospect as having been part of the 50s at the time was sort of invisible, and clearly jazz players at the time were the voice of the underground entity. Is that how you came upon jazz?
I used to listen to late-night radio broadcasts from Manhattan, which I was able to get over in New Jersey across the river. And at that time, there were great late-night shows playing jazz, which was in a very fruitful period at that time, in the late 50s and early 60s. Mort Figa, Symphony Sid was still on then, and there was a few other shows that you could hear in the evening or late at night. And when I first heard these shows when I was about 10, 11 years old, I immediately could see that there was something about jazz that I saw as, well, first of all, I liked the music, but I think I also saw it as a cultural alternative, and there was something authentic about it, which I detected even at that age, and you know, I still love it. It's I think it holds up perfectly, and it's the records that were coming out day by day at that time are now classics, so I think that proves it, really.
A record, Donald, that clearly you knew very well when it came out. It's the Oliver Nelson record, Blues and the Abstract Truth.
A great record.
Clearly a record like that had an impact on you, not only as a fan, but a budding musician and a composer.
Yeah, that record, I think, was really appreciated by jazz fans, in that it was using all, at the time, which were the latest arranging techniques, and a lot of dissonance, a bit on the commercial side, I think, as far as just the sound of the arrangements, but it was beautifully made, and the musicians were terrific, had a great rhythm section. And Eric Dolphy, of course, who was way ahead of his time, was one of the soloists.
The idea of it sounding commercial to you is interesting to me because you're making adventurous, very artistic commercial music today.
Yeah, well, I think we were influenced by the more commercial jazz as well as, I guess what you'd call the more heady or experimental jazz. Well, by experimental, I guess it's actually the wrong word. What I'm actually talking about is more, I guess, more authentic individual kind of jazz like Sonny Rollins or Miles Davis, who I think really were defying commerciality and really had no interest in it, at least musically speaking. And I think rock and roll also influenced this, which was definitely commercial music. And I guess when we started writing, there was all kinds of different music around, and it kind of there was a lot of sort of music crossing over with other kinds of music, or it was just beginning then, and there was something amusing about it to us, the fact that, for instance, we used to try playing Charlie Parker type lines on distorted electric guitars and things like that, and aside from being new sounding to us, it was also very funny. And I think a kind of irony about what had happened to popular music and where it was situated at that time was one of the things that we used to experiment at.
Where were you doing these experiments?
Well, Walter Becker and I met at Bard College. We were both attending school there, and from 65 to 69, I think Walter actually dropped out after the first couple of years. But I met him there, and he was interested in doing the same kind of thing I was, which was in blending these different genres and so on, and somehow putting together a group that could project that.
Were you a music student per se there, or were you a literature student?
Both. I would switch around. I started out as an English major, and then switched to music, which was actually the first time I considered making music a profession. Before that, I was really an amateur player, and he used to write songs, but wasn't that serious about it. And they, unfortunately, I guess, the head of the music department didn't think that I had the technical expertise, and I was actually thrown out of the music department, at which point I went back into literature and graduated in English.
What sort of equipment did you bring musically when you decided to be a musician? What I mean is, had you studied harmony? Had you studied theory? Had you played in little trios?
I had a trio in high school, but I was mostly self-taught as a pianist and off records. I listened to a lot of Red Garland records and a lot of Wynton Kelly performances, and just picked it up off records. And I had some lessons, and when I got to college, I took harmony and composition and so on, and also spent a summer at the Berklee School in Boston. So I had some training, but I started late.
What about your songwriting start?
I wrote songs since I was a kid, very primitive songs, of course, when I was really young, but by the time I was in high school, I was writing comic songs and theatrical songs.
Like Tom Lehrer songs or something?
That's a good comparison, I think.
Were you using narrative? Were you developing character in your songs?
Yeah, I guess it just really came naturally to me. I didn't, there was no theory behind it. I just, it was interesting to me to use character and plot and all the things associated with, storyline in a song.
Is there a writer or two that you would point somebody toward if they were going to try to do a study on your music?
In high school, Walter and I were both interested in a few writers in common. We both were very big fans of Nabokov, and who seemed to both of us to be probably the greatest living writer. And he I think that was an influence, if it's possible for Nabokov to be an influence on rhythm and blues. But also, and that was kind of the days when black humor was burgeoning. That is to say, not black American humor, but rather sick humor or very sort of cynical humor. Lenny Bruce, I think, as a stand-up comic, was representative of that. But there were writers like Terry Southern and John Barth in those days was writing more or less in that genre, and Kurt Vonnegut certainly. And I think that that kind of extreme irony was interesting to us at that time.
So how do we get from Bard College to Do It Again? What's that transition like?
Well, after college, we tried to get a job doing some kind of professional music. It really didn't matter what it was. We had a bunch of songs with us. We were trying to sell, really, or use in some way, but we didn't have a band. So we went up to the famous Brill Building, which is on Broadway in New York City, which has long been a place where musicians go to start out songwriting and so on. And a lot of the great standard songwriters were there, and also in the 50s, the writers who wrote commercial rock and roll were there. Lieber and Stoller, who we were big fans of, who worked with the Coasters and the Drifters in the 50s, and also Carole King, and most of them were no longer active in the Brill Building at that time, but we looked at it as a sort of some sort of edifice that would, with a lot of, we pictured all these music publishers with pianos, and that's exactly what it was, really, except that not much was going on at that time. There were a few record companies left in the 60s, Buddha Records, and Jeff Barry, a couple other writers were there, and we got a job writing pop songs there, and ended up working for one of the a production company of Jay and the Americans, which was a group from the early 60s. And from there we kept, through various contacts, we finally got a job in California as staff writers at ABC Records in Los Angeles. And we wrote pop songs for them, which were all terrible failures. We were very bad pop songwriters, really, but we kept writing those other songs, and eventually we got a band together and made a record.
These days, the term Steely Dan sound has been used to describe other people's music. Well, it sounds kind of like Steely Dan. Mm-hmm. How would you describe the Steely Dan sound? It may surprise people, but it really wasn't anything planned. I think when we started making records, we had certainly had a certain ideal of how a record should sound, but I don't think we knew how it would come out. It always seemed to me that one of the things that we were looking for was clarity, making sure you could hear all the instruments, and not too much reverberation or echo to cloud it in a way that muddied up the actual sound of the instruments. And if there's any model, I would say a lot of the jazz records Rudy Van Gelder recorded for Prestige in the late 50s have a very dry but live sound, which I guess Walter and I, both having loved those records as kids, kind of also like that sound. Of course, those records were mono, and the translation from a jazz quintet to a small rock and roll orchestra is mixing it into a different thing. But still, I think we may have had that in mind. When you compose a song, are you starting with changes? Are you starting with melody line? Are you starting with a hook? Are you starting with... Usually I start off with an idea for lyrics.
then I'll sit down at the piano, and some music will come to me which goes with it or goes against it, or just something that somehow will enhance the lyric. Then I'll usually go ahead with the music and write that, and then fill in the rest of the lyrics afterwards. I still write on the piano because originally I think to some extent I'm still scared of the technology kind of beating me, and I want to use the technology and not really be. I'm scared of being controlled by it, and I figure if I start writing with the machines, then it'll start to sound like everyone else's records. So I try to get a good musical foundation on the piano first, and then I'll go over to the machines and basically use it as an orchestrating tool.
How Steely Dan records is kind of this mysterious process. How did the glamour profession come about?
Well, I think we use a different method for every song depending on what works best. We don't have any separate, any general theory of recording. That one, I think we started with a drum track. That is to say, we laid down a drum track, and I can't remember who at the time. I guess it was Steve Gadd.
He's on the final version, in any case.
And we then started adding layers on top of that. I think some parts may have been sequenced. That is to say, they were done with computers. Although when we work with computers, I think unlike a lot of other people, we try to make them sound as unmechanical as possible, which takes a lot of time. It turns out if you want something to sound human, it takes a lot of very sophisticated programming and trial and error and so on. And so we did that, and then eventually we have some kind of track, and then get some players to come in and play over it, just like you would at a normal session.
How much of it is in your head going in? I mean, what do you go in with?
When we started, we went in with some kind of chord chart, and basically depended on the musicians to add parts, and we discussed certain things with them and so on. But as we went on, our charts became more detailed, and when we on my solo record, for instance, was really completely charted, and had most of the details were written in.
The song in question is "The Glamour Profession" from the album Gaucho. Now, what's that song about?
That song is about a cocaine dealer who finds himself getting some kind of power by selling drugs to celebrities and hanging around with them, being in their scene. And I think in the first verse, there's a basketball player meets him in the parking lot, and he gives him some, and then there's some various other decadent, moneyed people that he deals with. And I think it's the idea of it is the kind of power that I think someone like that feels. It's sort of the only way that someone on that social level, in a way, can have power, is by being associated with power. And that's basically what the song is about.
It's about power.
It's about power, yeah.
The idea of a hit song being written about power, it's an exception. Your music is exceptional in terms of what's going on out there.
Well, I think there was a lot more freedom on the radio when we started. There was room for a lot of different kinds of music, and there isn't now, but I think we were lucky in that there's a certain carryover, and I think the program directors and the DJs have been really good about that, actually, in realizing that we were trying to do something a little different, and yet still playing the stuff on the radio. I will say that Century's End, which is a song I wrote for in conjunction with the Bright Lights, Big City soundtrack, did not go on top 40 radio. Not so much because the song wasn't liked, but they just said that today's playlist on top 40 was so constricted, or rather just so narrow, that it just didn't fit into the format anymore. So that I think maybe the freedom that we had in the past is not there anymore to some extent.
It might be careless rapture, love in the city at Century's End. Did you try to respond specifically to the story that Bright Lights Big City told?
For a while, I had an idea of writing a song that would compare the end of the century in Europe, that is a kind of fin de siècle sensibility of, say, in Paris or Vienna in the end of the 19th century, with the present end of the century. And when this movie came along and they needed a song, I could see how it kind of paralleled the story anyway of Bright Lights Big City. And so I made up my own characters and wrote the song with the late Timothy Mayer, the lyrics, which I like the lyrics. I think they came out really well and do present a kind of a nice picture of urban life as it exists in 1989.
A sense of hurtling toward the future, accelerating toward the future.
Yeah. Well, I guess I've written other songs like that have that. I think IGY from The Nightfly has a bit of that, and some of the other songs on The Nightfly as well.
Brings up the song The New Frontier.
Right, that's one too.
The New Frontier, though, when it treats the subject, has that kind of romantic fog about it. I mean, of course, it's written from the 50s point of view. It's a dream vision. It's almost just a step ahead of the Flash Gordon vision of the future in a way. We're having a summer smoker underground in a bomb shelter, I mean, just the kind of romantic adaptation of something that might be terrifying.
Well, I think The Nightfly's, more or less autobiographical, sort of presenting my childhood, growing up in the late 50s and early 60s, and of course the fallout shelter was a big item then, and I like the idea of this is actually based on a true story that I heard about of some kids their parents go away for the weekend, and they used the fallout shelter to have a party. It was a perfect party room. It had plenty of stale Twinkies and so on in it, and all the food that you might need, and a lot of beer. And I like the idea of a fallout shelter used for something connected with life rather than something connected with destruction. Of course, the fallout shelters probably would have been useless in the case of Oblivion anyway, so at least you could have a party.
Yeah, why not party?
Why not?
The New Frontier from the Nightfly album. The Nightfly album suddenly brought Donald Fagen into focus as opposed to Steely Dan into focus. If I could pin down a distinction that I hear between the Nightfly album and the Gaucho album, the album as a whole has a bit more of an intense jazz aesthetic about it. The song Maxine, for example, sounds like a jazz standard.
Well, I'd heard that Mel Torme's been doing that song in his act, so maybe it will become part of the jazz lexicon. That particular album, because it was about the era of the late 50s and early 60s, I tried to use forms that from that time, and I think that's part of the reason there may have been more jazz harmony and so on. It's just the kind of music I associate with that time. Although it also comes naturally to me, so it's basically the harmonic vocabulary I work with. But I think I've also just have through the years just learned more about jazz and jazz harmony because I wasn't trained young. It's almost an advantage in that through the years I by studying myself and occasionally taking some lessons and so on, I've find new material to use all the time. As far as the lyrics, I think they're mostly the main difference is they're more personal, more subjective, perhaps, because I was writing about myself, really. The sound of the record, I think Walter and I developed that together, and at this point I really don't know who contributed what, or it's just become a natural way for me to work, using certain vocabulary of sounds.
Do you think of yourself as an artist?
Sure. Why not? I think because of the world we grew up in, which is was very different from the world before you. Since American life is based on lack of tradition and inventing yourself and all that, I think you really don't have any models to go by, and you can read certain things and listen to certain music, but in the context of the times, I think that you really end up just making up your own kind of art and not going by previous models, and I think that that's part of the energy of popular art.
As opposed to the art that's in the museums, you're having to do your art in the context of we'll get on the radio.
Right. It's the commercial music and film music, television music. It's this is what I grew up with. Aside from jazz. You can. I wrote an article, I guess, a year ago about Henry Mancini. I occasionally do a column for Premiere magazine, which is a film magazine, and I guess at that time I was thinking how much I derived from Henry Mancini's music, which generally isn't thought of as any kind of art music, or it's basically functional music and designed to ornament or enhance TV shows and films and so on. But he was very original in his way, and there's a lot of crossover from jazz. He used a lot of very good jazz musicians on the West Coast, and there's both something amusing about it to me, and also very touching about it. And I think at this point we have to take what was given to us and make something out of it, which is a academic perhaps, or a conservative critic of the culture would think is a big pile of trash, but nevertheless this is what we've got, and it really has to do with the way you look at it.